Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for tuning in this evening. Tonight we're starting the new series on WaterWorks, all about shooting waterfalls, streams, and creeks. Tonight is session number 1, all about shutter speeds. And since I'm on the clock now, let's go ahead and jump right on in. Okay, so tonight we're going to be talking about shutter speeds for shooting waterfalls, streams, and creeks. Now I know what's going to happen. Someone's going to raise their hand and say, hey, I've always been told that 1 second is the perfect shutter speed, and that's what I always use, or half a second. It's a funny thing, shooting waterfalls and creeks and streams. It's all about personal preference. Some people have a personal preference for much longer exposures, and some people have a preference for much shorter exposures. It's all about finding what you like the best in your work, and not letting yourself be influenced too much by other people. I personally typically like images like what you see on the screen now. A little bit longer exposure. I like to remove some of that texture that's in the water. But that's just my personal preference. Don't let me influence you. I'm just going to be giving you some tools and some techniques to think about when you're in the field the next time. So some people like a really short duration exposure. This is 1/160th of a second. And as you can see, the water has been frozen here. It's all sharp and frozen here along the river. All the movement's gone. It's all sharp and in focus. And that's fine. If that's what you like, that's great. I also encourage everybody to experiment. Maybe go just a little bit slower. Here we're at 1/40th of a second. And as you can see, the texture in the water is starting to blend together. And then here is 1.6 seconds. Now we can see that that texture is really gone, and we're starting to get that pulled clouds look. That really nice, what people refer to as silky water. And this one is 6 seconds, a little bit longer. So you can see there's quite a bit of difference between 1/160th of a second and 6 seconds. It's all about finding what works for you, but it's also about finding out what works for the scene. Not every scene is going to look the same at 6 seconds. A lot of it depends on how fast the water is moving through that stream, creek, or waterfall, whatever it is that your subject is. The speed the water is moving makes a huge difference. As you can see in this scene from Big Creek a couple of years ago, it had rained for about a week before. And so 2 seconds, that water is pulled and stretched a whole lot more now. But that's because that water was moving so fast, if you had tried to step into it, it would knock you down and drag you down the river. I shot this scene at a wide variety of exposure durations, from 1.3 seconds all the way to 8 seconds. I do this for a couple of reasons. Some of those we're going to get into in another session here during the WaterWorks series, but I also like to give myself plenty of options to choose from when I get back into the darkroom. In the field, I might like this one that's 8 seconds, but in reality, when I get back home and I'm looking at it, I might like this one that's only 1.3 seconds, or this one that's 2 seconds. I might decide once I get back that one of these fits my eye a little bit better. Or I might find out that on the 8-second image, I have allowed my highlights to get just a little too bright in this area. They're not clipped, but they might be. So that's something to worry about, is to consider shooting all different exposures so that you make sure you can keep that data there in the waterfall. You don't want to let it get too bright and wash out. There are a lot of things to take into consideration when choosing your shutter speed. So that's why I like to shoot a broad range of them. I typically will shoot one that has no filters, and then I will work all the way through all the filters I want to use, creating different shutter speeds. To start with, just shoot a wide variety of shutter speeds, focusing on whether or not you still have texture in the water or if you've lost all of that texture in the water. You'll notice that things change as the shutter speed gets longer. Here in this shutter speed at 0.8 seconds, there's lots of texture in the splash pool over here to the right of the main falls. But by the time we get to 8 seconds, we can see through all of that and see the rocks at the bottom. So that gives you more options once you get back into the darkroom to pick from. So I always encourage shooting a wide variety. This is another scene from that same trip. There had been so much rain in the area leading up to this trip that the water flow was so much more than I was ever accustomed to shooting in a place that I am extremely familiar with. It brought about compositions that did not exist before and have not existed since. The water flow was so high and so fast that my typical 4-second exposure that is usually my go-to for me on this scene was just too much. There wasn't enough texture left here in this water. I didn't like the way this was looking here in the background, and I didn't really like the way it looked at the bottom of this big flat rock. But thankfully I had been shooting more than one shutter speed. 1.6 seconds was still just not what I was after. But 0.6 seconds was just what I was after. It worked just fine for what I was trying to do. And contrary to what is my normal, I really liked this one. I liked this texture in it. It kept the texture through here that kept the undulating waves of that water moving through there. A little bit of the violence of it hitting this rock here. And the splashes, and it just made more interest. So sometimes shorter duration exposures are just right. They are just what the scene needed. So far we've covered shutter speeds from 0.6 seconds on up to 8 seconds. And that's typically what I will use when I'm shooting around a stream or a waterfall. But on occasion, I'm going to go really crazy and go really long. The image you see on screen right now was a 301 second exposure in Cloudland Canyon several years ago. Part of the reason I had to go that long was that waterfall was raging so hard that the texture in the water just wouldn't go away on an 8 or 10 second exposure. Everything I did, the texture was still on the water. And what I really wanted was for that water to be nice and smooth, to give this nice little glow of a reflection of that waterfall. So I had stacked up a whole bunch of ND filters and stretched this one out to 301 seconds. That's a long exposure for waterfalls. But sometimes that's what's needed. Sometimes it's a nice and surreal image, and sometimes I just like doing it because I can. This is a set of images from Grotto Falls in the Smoky Mountains, and it ranges from 2.5 seconds to 4 seconds to 5 seconds, and finally out to 116 seconds. And this was the image that I finally decided on. I liked the pattern in the splash pool more. I liked the water flowing all the way through the scene. It was a nice calm morning, so I didn't really have to worry about a lot of leaf movement in the distance. But it gave me that really surreal and ethereal feel that I like in a lot of my images. Don't be afraid to go really long. Sometimes you might like the result. So that just about wraps up the different shutter speeds that we would normally use shooting streams, creeks, and waterfalls. We've covered everything from just a fraction over a second to many minutes and everything in between. And that's kind of how I shoot all my scenes when I'm out in the field. I will shoot them in a variety of different shutter speeds just to give me a lot of options when I get back. Next week, we're going to talk about the filters that you need when you're out shooting around streams, creeks, and waterfalls. and the different tools that you'll want to use while you're out doing that. So I hope you'll tune in next week. There, I hope that wasn't too bad and didn't take too much of your time this evening. The glass is barely cold. I hope you'll join me again next week as we get into session number 2, all about filters for shooting in the waterfalls and streams and creeks, part of the WaterWorks series. Tune in next week. Thanks.